Hi there, Martin. It's great to talk to you again, and we hope this will be a part of our regular conversations about. We found each other intellectually and share a lot of experiences and views, but not on everything. And I hope our audience will read us, or I should say, view us, and listen to our. We're slightly of a different generation, but we've worked a lot in journalism, and we thought that on this particular first joint video podcast that we'd talk a little bit about American and British journalism and journalism in general, and how it's been kind of corrupted, or has it been corrupted? I mean, um, you know, the journalism back in the early 20th century was basically war propaganda. So the idea that there, I don't know, was there ever a utopian period when journalism was really honest? I've always tried to stay honest. I think you have as well. But I just say what I was. I spent a few of my childhood years in Sweden. I was born in London, and then I went through the basic school system in Sweden after my parents divorced, and my Swedish mum came back to Sweden with me. I then went to do my A levels in the UK, and I went to university in the UK, and then I spent my career in the UK until the last few years when I came to Sweden on a totally unrelated matter. That is, I had a Swedish girlfriend, and I also thought at the back of my mind, well, I wanted to get out of the British journalism because I thought that already then that you have to be compromised to be able to work. I mean, with the arrival of the internet, it was more and more obvious that the real story often diverged from the narrative presented by the media. And I thought, well, I was getting very irritated by that. And then I also thought I was knocking around. I was editing, doing a subbing in a lot of British papers, and then I was working as a journalist in science and engineering, and working for a big British engineering magazine. But I thought engineering's not my thing. Although I did have a science background at university, I wanted to do something else, and I wanted to explore. I wanted to write books, and Sweden, as a quiet country, afforded me to do that. Could live off my savings partly, and also I wanted to pick up some of the stories in Scandinavia, the Cold War type stories, also stories about immigration, things like that, because it was a bit of a blank spot for the rest of the world. I mean, it's a country that Scandinavia's thought of as being boring and pacifist and all that, and a lot of that's true. But there are enough stories. I thought I could find a niche here. But we were talking just before we came on air about Eastern Europe and our common friends there. What made me want to be a journalist, I guess, was in the late 1980s, by which time you were already a well-established journalist. And I remember reading The Independent, which was then the best British newspapers. I was sitting in the Students' Union and eating chips one at a time and dipping them in ketchup and literally reading every single article in the foreign news pages. And then I became features editor of a student newspaper, and then I got into a journalism school called City University, as one of two, is Cardiff and City. And then I was traveling. I was backpacking around China in the summer of 1991, and I thought the Cold War was more or less over because the wall fell in 1989. And then I took the cheapest way to get back to Europe was to take the Trans-Siberian, and it was only $150 because hyperinflation was going on in Russia. It was easy to get a transit visa. So I took the train back to Moscow and then to Europe. And I just happened to be in Moscow during the 3 days of the August Putsch in 1991. And I remember I was sitting on a van underneath the White House in Moscow, where Yeltsin and 100,000 other Russians, Muscovites, had taken a stand. And I thought I thought this is it. I really want to work with this. And I spent a few years in Eastern Europe, covering East European affairs, post-communism, the war in Yugoslavia, and so on. And then I went back to London, and I wrote a memoir about it. And then I did a lot of freelancing and so on. But I just want to say that the immediate thing that perhaps uh, is on my mind at the moment, because the last book I read was a book that says that completely overturns our understanding of the end of communism. Because I still believe the media story that the revolutions in Eastern Europe were sort of a people's revolutions, peaceful velvet revolutions. Well, I've now read a book and then I thought, well, then and then all these color revolutions only started coming into play in the year 2000, after the Serbian Revolution and in the color revolutions of Ukraine and so on. But it turns out this Russian author has written a book saying that the revolution in Lithuania in 1991, which was the shooting of these unarmed Lithuanians who were officially they were being shot by the Russian soldiers who turned up and tried to disperse them from the TV tower, but it seems they're all shot in the back. So it was just by their own people who were in nearby residential buildings. And Lithuanians, I think, were quite prominent in the Maidan revolution in 2014. Now, that's never been published in the Anglo media, neither the British nor American. I mean, my sense of disillusionment and disappointment with the British media and the American media is total. I mean, I think I've stayed true to the course and always been, and as a result, I've often worked in the alternative media now. But at least I could say what I want and pursue the truth where it follows. But my disillusionment is total. That said, I did find that the Americans I had on my show on TNT last year were often more outspoken and perhaps more honest. And there is perhaps a journalism in America, even if it is in the alternative sphere, is perhaps better than British journalism. Whereas to me, British journalism is totally corrupted by MI6 and the contacts between in the British establishment or deep state or public school connections or whatever. So it's just much more of a, especially in foreign journalism, much more tool of statecrafts. But you've got a very, very long career working in both US and the UK. So what are your thoughts about? I mean, how did you said that in an email that you were disappointed by your inability to break through in British journalism, whereas you found America much more welcoming. So talk about some of these things that crop up in your mind when talking about British and American journalism.
Well, I had a very slow and unconventional, I think, path into mainstream American journalism. When I flourished in mainstream for a number of very fortuitous reasons for a very long time, and it's still kind of my natural milieu. But I'm from Northern Ireland. Uh, I'm the son of basically an emotionally Irish Republican father, though he was very loyal to Britain too, and he was very much in the line of the reconciliation of communities in Northern Ireland all his life, as am I. And my mum was a loyal, true believing loyalist. For her, the great social moment of the year was when she would sit down with my aunties or sisters to watch the Queen's Christmas message every year. While my dad would sit in the corner, summoning me over, mumbling darkly to me, son, never remember the biggest robber in the world was John Bull. So the Irish border did not just run down the middle of Ireland, it ran down the middle of my parents' bedroom as well.
Hmm.
But I grew up existentially very much British and proud of it, liked being Irish emotionally, but to me that was very much a secondary identity. And it was only in my 30s when I was back working for the Belfast expletive deleted telegraph. Forgive me, I took a blood oath never to refer to that benighted, now eclipsed newspaper with anything but an expletive from my early years on. But I had many close friends there, some of whom thankfully are still alive and flourishing today. But it gave me a different perspective. It showed me Northern Ireland, not as I had grown up in it as a democratic British society, but as a society under British military rule, which is a very different thing. And also a society where both in the Protestant and Catholic sides of the community, democratic government had broken down, as I fear it's now going to break down here in the United States. And that's a very sinister thing. But I was a Thatcherite in those years, and in the context of that time, still very much am. And I saw and still see Mrs. Thatcher as basically an old-fashioned fighting liberal, fighting to defend the best of what liberal society ought to be against violent revolutionary forces from every side. Now, there are other aspects to that too. Some terrible things happened there. And in fact, when I look back, many of these terrible things were happening in front of my eyes, and my own friends and colleagues on the main newspaper of record in Northern Ireland, where I was for 4.5 years, were recognized this at the time. And I was still too naive and blind to see it. It was only years later, after many years in America and seeing other things in the world, that I started to reevaluate what the British deep state had been doing in broad daylight, even, and getting away with completely, as it still does, in Northern Ireland. Now, I'm going to be a bit disjointed here, because before I go back to my own career, I think your observation about the contrast today between American and British journalism is very true. It was different when I went over. I came to America in 1985, and I came after 6 years not in British journalism, but in Northern Irish journalism, which is a very different thing. And as a result, I think I flourished in America as I wouldn't have done if I'd been conditioned to the British system. But at the time, I thought the British system was vastly superior to the American system at that time. And I'll tell you why. Uh, Deep states in any country always work hard to manipulate and manage public opinion in the news. And in major democratic nations, they usually succeed very well in doing so when they put their mind to it. But it's always a debate. And as George Orwell said, it's still very different from having managed news in a democratic system, however hypocritical or, what's the word? Not inferior, flawed, however flawed it is, from a totalitarian system where everything is mercilessly repressed. Orwell recognized this in the 1930s and 1940s, and all my life, and still to this day, I still believe it's true. But I think you're much closer to the Orwellian nightmare in Britain than we are in America, because America is big, and America has most of the internet. And the internet grew up in America, and in many respects in reaction to the American media. Because when I came over here, as I say, I revered the British media and actually despised the American media for a very clear reason. In Britain in those days, you had, as now, many different newspapers, many different outlets for the news, but there was genuine debate and division among them. The division was real. The Sun went after the Daily Mirror's supporters. The Mirror was hostile to the Sun. Satirists and BBC openly mocked the Daily Express and the Daily Mail. I am old enough to remember in the 1960s and 1970s, and even in the 1980s, when the BBC questioned the governments at the time. Governments in the 1980s, the Thatcher governments, were openly despised by the producers and major journalists of the BBC, and this was openly expressed. At the time, I thought this was outrageous and disloyal on behalf of the BBC. In many respects, I still believe it was. But at least there was open debate. At least there were cracks and fissures. From the time of Tony Blair onwards, the British media and deep state have been in perfect harmony. And especially when they follow what they pretend to be and what the public in Britain is deluded enough to believe is a liberal progressive agenda. Right now, President Trump is pushing hard for not just a conservative, but an increasingly extreme agenda in America. And although I supported Trump and voted for him in the election, this increasingly worries me. Not his economic policies, which I think are very underestimated and very successful, and are very good for the American people by and large of every racial background. And the president has never been a racist. He's certainly not anti-Muslim. He has traditional Jewish members in his own family. He has record numbers of Hispanics and African Americans voting for him, not just in 2016, but their numbers grew in 2020 to 2024. The president has never been a racist and is not, nor is Vice President Vance, not in the slightest. But what I think we're starting to see now is the president reacting to the left-wing politicization, which has gone on in America for 30 years since the days of Clinton, and especially strongly and skillfully under Barack Obama and the shameful and appalling Joe Biden, our most sinister president to this point. But there is a man who was really a fascist in this day in the 1930s, though he was a fascist who fought the Ku Klux Klan, hated the Nazis, and defied white racists to give Black Americans in Louisiana unprecedented economic opportunities and dignity. So he was a complex and interesting man, but he was still a fascist.
Huey
And his
Long,
name was
right?
Huey Long.
Yeah.
Exactly. Huey P. Long in the 1930s. First governor of Louisiana and then senator from Louisiana. And he effectively ran Louisiana as a one-man fascist state. He really did.
Mm.
And President Franklin Roosevelt regarded him as one of the two most dangerous men politically to democracy in America. FDR felt the other one was General Douglas MacArthur. Interesting extremes on both sides. But now, Long died violently in 1935. And there are, of course, conspiracy theories, which, if you like, we'll get you into at some point, because I reject them totally. I came across 35 years ago what to me was compelling evidence that he was killed by incompetence by his own bodyguards,
Mm.
who then covered up their own incompetence. They didn't mean to kill him. They were shooting an innocent man who they thought was an assassin, and they fired so many bullets they mortally wounded their own boss at the same time. It was a classical American incompetent mess up, totally. And what's the biggest thing that deep states do, whether they're tiny in Louisiana or massive in Washington or London? They cover up their own mess ups, of which there are a limitless number. That's
Mm.
always according to the laws of
Mm.
bureaucracy, their primary rule,
Mm.
right? But the reason I digress here is Huey Long had a wonderful line, which I think has come true in our time. He was asked if fascist dictatorship could ever take over America. And he replied, sure it can. Easy. Only it'll be called anti-fascism.
Yeah.
And that is what you have in Britain today.
Right.
And that is what we have had in America increasingly in the last 20 years,
Mm.
really 25, 28 years, because a fascist state was really started to be
Mm.
established not under President Obama,
Mm.
who is not a monster, far from it, a
Mm.
well-meaning man,
Mm.
but not in a position ever to push against the forces. But again, under the idiotic and easily manipulated George W. Bush,
Mm.
Bush the Younger, the second Bush, with the Freedom Acts and whatever else they call them in 2001.
Mm.
And that was when the legislative structure for a fascist state in America was really established, nearly
Mm.
a quarter of a century ago now.
Mm.
Nearly a quarter. But for most of that time, it's been run by liberals.
Mm.
And it can be run by people on the right as well. Trump is trying to take it over because Trump in 2016 was taken by surprise to the degree to which for 4 years,
Mm.
the deep state tried to, and the American deep state, backed by Britain, very strongly backed by Britain, tried to undermine him.
Mm.
And of course, once he took over this time, it was payback time.
Mm.
But we have just had Trump being greeted warmly by King Charles,
Mm.
who is a very, I think, in good ways rather than bad ways, but he's very much a liberal progressive fellow himself, always
Mm.
has been. And unlike his mother, the king, to his credit, has always been a man of principle. And
Mm.
he's always been much more unpopular and controversial because of that.
Mm.
Because if you pretend not to have a brain at all, as Queen Elizabeth did, then everyone will love you.
Mm.
But if you have any principles that you care about, whether they're conservative or liberal, and the king's principles are clearly liberal, but
Mm.
you will automatically make enemies on the other side if you have the courage to speak out about them. And
Mm.
I think the king has always been, to his credit again, a courageous and outspoken man. But what
Mm.
are we just seeing? The king welcomed President Trump, and more importantly, Keir Starmer, a prime minister so inept that he can even make Boris Johnson look respectable, which
Mm.
should be impossible.
Mm.
He welcomed the president. Now, if you look at what Starmer has personally said about the president in years past, you look at what the Labour Party has said about the president, you look at what the British establishment has consistently said about the president for the past decade, this should be impossible. But what are we seeing? I think we are seeing another prophecy of George Orwell come true. The unforgettable ending of 1984, where the pigs who run the revolutionary state of Animal Farm
Mm.
meet the human farmers who kill the animals and eat them. And they're having a wonderful time together.
Mm.
And as other animals watch through the window, they see that the humans look like pigs.
Mm.
Very realistic comment there from Orwell, as usual. And the pigs increasingly look like piggish human beings. There
Mm.
is nothing to differentiate between them.
Mm.
And I think that is what we have just seen in Britain from the latest state visit of President Trump. There is nothing to differentiate between President Trump today and Keir Starmer. Once the president did his U-turn, which I think is bringing both Britain and America to the brink of destruction and nuclear war in confrontation with Russia over Ukraine, which is a catastrophically dangerous move to make. And the president yielded to the pressure of the Europeans on this. And therefore, he's not in the target of the British establishment or the British government or the deep state in Britain anymore. They're all on the same page. But it's an enormously dangerous, I believe, and even suicidal page. But as you see, America, this is being openly commented on, not in mainstream media, what my wife and many people like her call contemptuously the drive-bys. The term means you have a media establishment in New York City, you have a media establishment and movie center in Hollywood, out beside Los Angeles, LA, and the rest of the country, all the media masters in LA, Hollywood, and in New York City, Manhattan, look upon as the drive-bys. You drive by them or you fly over them. They're really flybys, not drive-bys, because almost nobody drives across America anymore. There's too much unpleasant reality. They might have. So you have two media elites in New York City and LA, and they're totally on the same page, and there is no daylight between them. But America is big. We are not just a continent, we are 330 million people. We are virtually the population and much larger in area and territory than all of Western Europe put together. And therefore, what have we had? We have had over the past quarter century, the internet, YouTube, independent media. What you're doing right now, of course, Pelle, independent podcasts. And first thousands of people look at them. And on the bigger podcasts, tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands and even millions of people look at them. And so your assessment is totally true. If you talk to anybody in the street in America, including in the middle classes, but especially working class people, you'll find a lot of skepticism. Almost nobody watches CBS News or CNN or PBS, Public Broadcasting System, and certainly it has no credibility outside the media elites and outside the government elites. Who work for government bureaucracies believe it. People who get 2 or 3 degrees at university, with a couple of degrees from Oxford myself, and you're a serious intellectual too, so you and I in a way are throwing stones at our own glass windows. But you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But people who have not been conditioned to progressivism, ready to look beyond the New York Times or the Guardian, or for that matter, the Daily Telegraph, people who are ready to think things out for first principles are fulfilling another of George Orwell's prophecies. When George Orwell has Winston Smith write in his diary, if there is hope, it must come from the proletariat. It must come from the pros, because all the serious people believe what they are taught. And I think I see this increasingly in Britain. When I came over here to America, it shocked me that what the New York Times said was true, what the LA Times said was true, what the Washington Post said was true. I worked for a small, disreputable newspaper, which was funded by Korean cult money. The Moonies funded the Washington Times. And they didn't dominate the Washington Times. The Washington Times really ran out of their control, because all the conservatives of different kinds, the Reagan true believers, which included me, and even a number of disreputable fascist types, and also unfashionable black conservatives and Hispanic conservatives would all gravitate to the Washington Times. So it was really the small, disreputable newspaper, like Malcolm Muggeridge talked about Time and Tide in the 1930s. It was a haven for anybody who didn't fit the mainstream. So it was a very fun and unconventional place to be. But the one key point was we were not part of the papers of record. But I contrasted this unfavorably with Britain, where I said, look, you have the Sunday Times, you have the Daily Telegraph, you have the Observer, you have the Guardian. You have lots of newspapers, both popular and elite, that argue with each other and are in competition with each other and
mm,
try to take the market from each other. And this is the way freedom needs to operate.
mm,
And I still believe that that's the best approach to have a lot
mm.
of different competing voices in an open, genuinely more or less free market.
So,
But you don't have that anymore in Britain. The BBC and all the major establishment outlets, both left and right, are basically in the same very narrow catchment area or window of opportunity. And anything to the right and anything to the left is completely banned. And as a result, of course, they blind themselves. This is how Brexit happened. And I'm not even in favor of Brexit
mm,
because
mm,
I think there's a lot that's wrong with the European Union. But
mm,
the way to change it should be the way Viktor Orban is changing it for Hungary from within. You
mm,
don't leave the benefits of the European Union, you
mm,
stay within, and then you do what you want anyway.
mm.
Now, if Viktor Orban can get away with that in tiny Hungary, why on earth cannot the great mighty British state with 75 million people and a sophisticated Whitehall apparatus, why couldn't they have done it that way too? And the
Mm.
answer is under David Cameron and his successors, they might have done. But Boris Johnson, for no other reason than greed and his own selfish ambition, and Nigel, what's his name? I always mispronounce the name, not Fabergé,
Farage.
Farage, right?
Yeah.
Farage. I think Fabergé might be better because he's a fraudulent demagogue.
Mm, mm,
And he's brought Britain to ruin, and he
mm,
doesn't have any solutions. There
mm,
are no solutions
mm,
except to enslave Ukraine and neo-colonialism, which is what the City of London is now desperately doing. But
mm,
even that is actually a reaction to Brexit.
mm,
Because if you do not get some independent source of support or some new colonies that you can drain dry,
mm, mm,
Britain is doomed to ruin. It's deindustrialized.
mm,
It would be different if we had a realistic industrial policy. But
mm.
no, they drink the same ghastly green Kool-Aid that the Democrats do in America and every party does in Germany.
Yeah, I mean, so Britain's
Perhaps,
being badly run because no one is dissenting from the commentariat. You cannot. There's a narrow opinion corridor,
exactly.
but there's nobody questioning the Ukraine war itself. And that's the direct cause of the spike in energy prices. And people talk about Putin's war, but I mean, it's the West that sanctioned Russia, not the other way around. And it was probably British agents who blew up Nord Stream. Or I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. Um, but nobody ever talks about that in the British media. But yeah, I mean, I'm trying to work on my show on TNT was basically about trying to work out where the locus of power lies, who runs the world. And you hear it's like sometimes it felt like I was at some kind of snake oil convention. I mean, you get all sorts of people. Some people think it's the UN, some people think it's the WHO, people think it's the Jews, some people think it's the British Empire, some people think it's the Americans, some people think it's the European Union, some people think it's whatever. So I was prepared. Maybe it's a little bit of truth in all of those things, but I want to. We just we're going to go into a pause, and because just to allow people to have a break, and we'll be back after that. Welcome back. We've got myself, Pelle, Neroth Taylor, and Martin Sieff, people with being our bonnet about standards of journalism, particularly in the UK. Now, just to summarize a little bit what we've been talking about, I mean, I said I was working a lot in Eastern Europe for the British press, and I got gradually, I remember around 1993 or 94. I was in Yugoslavia a few times, and I thought that the way that the Observer and other those people like Ed Viliamy running around and just supporting the Bosnians and having a very black and white picture, that didn't actually comport with reality. I mean, the local
Exactly.
UN soldiers tended to prefer the Serbs actually because they thought they were more honest, whereas the Bosnians were firing at their own people and bombing their own things. And anyway, I mean, in wars, it's hard to say who the good and the bad sides are. But the American press and some of the British press were very, very much wanted to talk about victimhood. And I thought, well, that's not quite true. That's not what I get from the local analysts, the UN soldiers who thought it was better. So I started getting a bit suspicious of journalism then. And then I think I was in. I remember one thing that really affected me was there was a woman from Channel 4 who won a top British journalism prize for filming the Serb death camps where they held Bosnians in. But it turned out they were not death camps. They were just transit camps, and what it was the Channel 4 team had gone behind a fence. So these guys were free to walk around in a sort of transit camp. And then they focused on the one guy who had tuberculosis. And that was tuberculosis he'd caught somewhere else. But, he was very emaciated and so on. And then they filmed it from behind a fence. And it was Bergen-Belsen 1992, right? And that's when this thing of the Holocaust was really big because the Schindler's List film was coming out. And then there was a guy, and she won a top journalism prize for that. And that was at the same time when a guy from Newsday, Roy Gutman, wrote a book about Serbian concentration camps, which were like death camps, but that was based on a source talking to another source. And that's been eviscerated by books like Diana Johnston, I think, writing in the late 1990s. But he won a Pulitzer Prize. And this woman, Penny Marshall, um, the living Marxism, as it was then, then morphed into Spiked, which is a famous British online magazine. But they exposed this. They talked to locals. They said no, it was just a transit camp of Bosnian men moving from one prison to another, and they were not being massacred in these. I mean, they were being killed, I guess, but I mean, not on this industrial scale. It was not. It was not a new Auschwitz. But that's the impression you get from talking to the British press and this Channel 4 thing and the day. And then it turned out that. The Bosnians had this New York public relations firm called Ruder Finn, who took out adverts where you had people in their Auschwitz pajamas next to pictures of Bosnians looking emaciated. And I think they may even have used that picture. So that's when I became completely cynical about British journalists, because these were colleagues of mine, as it were, or people I knew who knew them. And I was kicking around doing feature articles for the European and some articles for the Economist and so on, and really trying to stay honest. And I thought, well, this woman is catapulted into the top sphere. And Ed Vullimy was very famous. And I thought, and then I remember, and Living Marxism was sued, and it had to close down because it actually published the truth basically. And ITN, which ran Channel 4 News, which was a magazine newscast with deep pockets, basically destroyed a small magazine that was telling the truth. And then I remember 2003. I was working in Fleet Street as a sub at the Guardian and Independent on Sunday, I think. And I remember talking to the sub saying, well, this is going to be the end of this old style dishonest journalism, because of course it was at the time of the Hutton inquiry when all the lies of Iraq were exposed. Bloody hell, a couple of years later, they're at it again with the lies about Ukraine war and the lies about Syria and the lies about Libya. And I thought, well, it's not that far. Maybe a new generation's come into journalism. But I mean, there are lots of veterans of the Iraq war. The Iraq War was the one big time when the British press were really exposed for being liars. And they're now having to double down, because when it all comes out, so many careers will be destroyed. Or maybe they won't. Maybe they'll never have to face the music. Anyway, I got so I was so my awakening, as it were, coincided with, I guess, the arrival of the internet, and I've gradually lost faith in British journalism. And then I remember the Russiagate thing, which was full of the American mainstream media just told lies from start to finish about Trump and Russiagate. But at least then you had the beginnings of an alternative media. And I think America's a bigger place, as you say. And the thing, just to go back to what you were saying, I mean, your story is that you thought the British press was superior because there was a marketplace of ideas in a relatively small country, physically small country. Everyone was in London. I always thought that the competition brings out the best in people, but it turns out I also used to think so. And you were working for the Washington Times, which was more fun to work for, but it didn't have as competitive a market as London. So you kind of be saying, well, that wasn't as good. And you were sitting there as an expat in America saying, well, I met British journalism is much better. But do you really think the competition of London makes for better journalism? Because what I found working in London, now sitting in rural Sweden, is in rural Sweden, you can actually have thoughts for yourself and work things out for yourself. And you're not subjected, because if you're in a pressure cooker environment, everyone's trying to get ahead in journalism, everyone is chasing jobs, everyone is chasing commissions, then you dare not stand up, and you don't have the time to develop your own perspective on things. You grab the latest Reuters headline, and if you're competitive, competition can actually lead to conformism, not originality.
I agree with you 100%, Pele.
Mm.
And in fact, because it's all your fault because you let me talk so much,
Yeah.
and I talk too much anyway. The key point is when I thought American journalism was inferior to British, and I believe it was then, but this is 40 years ago. I'm talking about 40 years ago. And it has changed since, and you yourself have explained brilliantly and clearly precisely why. I am shocked when I look at British attitudes towards America. And this is from people, even on the so called conservative right, because, of course, there's a lot of class arrogance involved in this too. I think it's one of the reasons the Brexit vote took people by surprise in Britain. What I said before about George Orwell, the proletariat, people who are not arrogant and brainwashed and vain and think they are smarter than everyone else when they are not. When I was a boy, not a boy, even as a teenager in my 20s, when my mother was ill health and was dying, a line she kept saying to me was, "Marty, don't be a clever fool." And I knew what she meant because we thought from our Northern Ireland perspective, uh, not just Northern Ireland, but British society was being undermined by clever fools, and more conservative in a small C, not in the big C way. Irish society was, in those days at least, a haven from this, both North and South, whichever side of the border you were on. But today it is exactly, I believe, as you say. I am shocked by the number of my friends, most of whom successful professional people, often with impressive careers, now retired, friends of mine all of their lives, people who are, as human beings, admirable, but they are unbelievably ignorant. They swallow every lie conceivable.
Mm.
They swallow it. They believe it. They really believe that the British and American government sent 1.7 million Ukrainian boys to their deaths in what was always going to be a hopeless war against Russia. And this is not to say the Russians are harmless or vegetarians or kumbaya lovers. It is precisely because they are not. One has to deal with them carefully and respect them. I've worked for Russian outfits. I've worked with professional Russian outfits. When I was with a senior executive at United Press International, I negotiated what was, from our perspective at UPI, highly successful deals with major Russian news outlets to benefit both organizations in their different ways over a decade. And I like and respect Russian people. I'm not a Russia hater, but that does not mean you're dealing with innocent, pure, kumbaya worshipping pacifists. It would be a lot less dangerous if you were. They regard the war in Ukraine as being propelled on them with neo Nazis trying to conquer. This is their perspective, trying to conquer Russian-speaking provinces. And now, with American senators like Blumenthal openly boasting about bleeding Russia dry by using Ukraine to do it, what did you think they were going to do? The British and the American governments have sent 1.7 million Ukrainian boys to their deaths to kill 100,000 Russians. Bad enough, but not exactly a favorable kill ratio. And what about the poor Ukrainians? What have they died for? And yet, when you raise these issues, when you look for an end to the war, I am told I am a Russian lover, I am betraying Ukraine. Is it Ukrainian people telling me this? No, it is not. It is upper class British assholes who have no skin in the game, who are like those repulsive women in World War I who slapped veteran soldiers from the Western Front who were suffering from shell shock and gave them white lilies because soldiers who knew they were going back to their own deaths, and yet these contemptible little idiots on the home front would slap their faces. No, I am with Bertrand Russell, who went to jail and was brutally handled in British jails for being a conscientious objector during World War One. A man who was the best kind of pacifist in World War One, a man with guts, a man with courage.
Yeah,
we don't have that today.
Yeah.
Instead, in Britain, everybody wants to believe that it's more important to feel virtuous than And it doesn't matter. You see perfectly happily sending 1.7 million Ukrainian boys to be shot and gassed and artillery shelled and to die in screaming and
mm,
despair, as long as you, in your middle class London homes, reading The Guardian and the Daily Telegraph, can feel virtuous that you're
mm,
standing up to the big bad guys.
mm,
That's contemptible. And you know what? I do everything I can. It's really the reason I speak with you and on other media and open myself to hate mail, because I want Britain and America to survive
mm,
and not be nuked. But
mm,
there are millions of people who deserve to die in thermonuclear fire
mm,
among the liberal classes in Britain and America, because
mm,
they send so many other people to their hideous deaths, and
mm,
they propel their own societies to destruction, just so long as they can feel virtuous.
mm,
That's the bottom line for it.
mm,
Just so long as they can feel virtuous.
mm,
And the more degrees you have and the more impressive newspapers they read,
mm,
the more prone they are to be mindless puppets
mm.
beneath contempt.
I agree with you. I mean, and journalists who sacrifice their integrity just for a scoop or for a byline or to get on the front page by telling a lie that brings us closer to war, by writing a incredibly provo. I mean, Russians can read the newspapers very carefully, and day after day, the British press are saying, they take something and twist it so that now Trump is sending tomahawks to Ukraine. I mean, the Russians will react to that. So what happens is, for the sake of and everyone reads those alarmist headlines. So just because they want more clicks and more eyeballs or more reads, they will risk nuclear war. I mean, to me, that's unconscionable. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, these people are criminals basically for doing this kinds of thing. And um, I mean, I think that in some cases it is a genuine, it's ignorance. I mean, we're led by people who don't have a map, the political class who doesn't know what's going on in the world because they believe their idiot colleagues with whom they went to school, writing for the Guardian and the Telegraph and so on. And these people, and then there are some people who are cynical and know what's going on, and other people are dishonest. And we're led. I mean, in Europe, we're led by a political class that is running Europe into the grave, basically. And the media play a big role in that because we're orienteering without a map. We're orienteering with a map that leads us completely in the wrong place. So journalism has a lot to answer for, and I'm wondering. I mean, you referring to World War One. I actually wrote a book about World War One, and actually a lot of the things that we're talking about are dishonest press. Northcliffe talking about the German threat
Yes,
from 1900 onwards. I mean, basically they were predicting and gagging for war. So in a way, there's nothing new under the sun. I mean, history is circular in that sense. So it's not there was perhaps no ideal period. Maybe the 50s and 60s and 70s when journalism was in a period when it was unusually honest. But certainly, if you go back to the period before, I was researching the book while the Ukraine crisis going on, and it's striking that if you just change out the Germans for the Russians, it's the same hate
exactly.
basically. And again, the British were playing the civilizational card, the Huns, the barbarians from the east. There's this civilizational gradient with to be a British public school boy, you're at the top of the tree, and then the gradient goes down. So if you're in Berlin, you're sort of halfway barbarian from the east. And I think that Ukrainians were sold on this. They were taught that they were inferior beings, and they kind of half believe it. And the only way they can get into the hallowed little Oxford corridors that people like Edward Lucas inhabit is by hating their cousins further to the east, because by hating the Russians, even more barbarians, the orcs, they can enter into the hallowed grounds of being Western and West European. So it's incredibly racist, this British thing about being, and I think the Swedes suffer from it as well. They look up to they feel, I mean, they're very rich now, but I mean, they were poor 100 years ago, and there's this inferiority complex of being a slightly peripheral part of the world. And they thought they have to hate the Russians because there's actually quite a lot of similarities between Scandinavia and Russia. In northwestern Russia, the same types of people, same kinds of faces, and so on. But if they hate the Russians, then they too can become French or British, and the French are just as bad as the Brits, to be honest. Anyway, but the British brought it to a fine art, and I look at I'm half Swedish, but they don't get it. I mean, they hate the Russians and love the British, and they believe every turd of propaganda that can shat out of MI6 and ends up in the Swedish front pages day after day after day. So just today they said Putin's gonna the three NATO countries that Putin is about to attack. It's all rubbish. Anyway, um, no. So anyway, we started off saying that what's the difference between American and British journalism? You were saying that your experiences was that you felt that British journalism was much better. American journalism was I don't know, not as interesting anyway. You thought that competition led to better British journalism, and now you're kind of disaffected and disappointed. Well, I'm also disappointed, but as I said, I don't know if there ever was a time when journalism was brilliant. I mean, as I said, but I think that since let's say 2015, I think MI6 kind of captured the Guardian, for instance. I mean, they had a moment of greatness when Assange and Snowden were on their pages, and then I think that the British they struck a deal with the Guardian. They said, well, we're gonna control you, and we're not going to jail you or something, because after that guy, the editor left. I can't remember his name now, the guy with the pianist, and former Cosmo editor took over. It's really been downhill. I mean, it is the most dishonest paper in Fleet Street, and that's that guy Luke Harding, for instance, totally dishonest, totally. I mean, he writes his books with steel. I mean, he still maintains the myth about Russia having infiltrated the American administration. Anyway,
I think again, you're right. I agree with you, and it is a flip. The older I get, the more I by a German philosopher Hegel, who I was taught to sneer at in my own years at Oxford. But Hegel is right. There is a continual ironical spiritual dialectic, not a material one even, but a spiritual one in the world. Ideas provoke counter ideas. Both the idea and the counter idea become extreme and absurd. They either destroy each other or they infect each other. And a new synthesis emerges, which is usually better, but then it splits apart, and it's a continual process. So what we have seen here is America and Britain have flipped places. The American mainstream media is as bad as Britain's, but because America is so vast, and because the generational dynamic of awareness is so different over here from yours, you have, as you have said, we have a very vibrant, often ugly, brawling, but certainly diverse, sprawling sphere of podcasts on YouTube across the internet, with millions and even tens of millions of people arguing different points of views. I would recommend all viewers in Britain here to look at podcasts from America, especially by two veteran US Army officers who challenged the American deep state, Colonel Dan Davis and also Colonel Doug McGregor. And you can also look at people like Scott Ritter, a former United Nations arms inspector, and Colonel Larry Johnson. And these are people who routinely have tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of hits on their media. And I don't agree with everything all of them or any of them have to say by any means, but they are free men and women, and they speak their mind. And there is debate there. There is breathing space, to use another phrase from my patron saint, George Orwell. There are breaks in the ice, so there is coming up for air. You can come up for air. In Britain, if you take the BBC seriously and the Guardian seriously and the Daily Telegraph seriously, you are lost and there is no hope.
And I mean, I'm not a fan of let's say, but GB News and Talk TV are the British alternative media. But I mean, all they do is bash Muslims. I mean, they don't challenge the Ukrainian
that's not
war.
the way. Exactly.
And so they're very predictable. I mean, and they're very repetitive. I mean, they're not genuinely open-minded. They're just very they're very anti-Muslim, basically, and pro-Zionist. And I don't agree with them at all. And then there's the Duran's quite good, but they're run by two former Greeks. But that's about the only thing. No, it's terrible. I mean, and I sympathize with you having all these British establishment retired friends, incredibly smug. But anyway, well, we'll try and enlighten people on this podcast, won't we, Marty? So
I'm with you all the way, my friend. Absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much. And all of you out there, have a great evening. And we'll be back next week. Thank you so much.